Welcome, and thank you for joining Zonta International, the Zonta Club of Billings, and the Montana Native Women's Coalition for this important conversation about the missing and murdered Indigenous people crisis, which affects Indigenous communities across the globe. We hope this will be an interactive session and invite you to join the conversation. We will have dedicated time for questions at the end of today's session. However, please feel free to submit your questions at any time using the Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom screen. It is now my pleasure to introduce Zonta International President Sharon Lingenbeck. Sharon, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Megan, and welcome again to all of you. It is wonderful to see so many people here with us today. As Zontians, we envision a world in which women's rights are recognized as human rights, and every woman is able to achieve her full potential. A world in which women have access to all resources and are represented in decision-making positions on an equal basis with men. A world where no woman lives in fear of violence. We cannot realize this vision without recognizing the increased vulnerabilities of Indigenous women and girls. Today is Indigenous Peoples' Day in the United States, but we know Indigenous communities across the globe face many challenges. I am so grateful to the Zonta Club of Billings and the Montana Native Women's Coalition for joining us today to share more about the missing and murdered Indigenous people crisis and how we can advocate with Indigenous women for change. Thank you for your presence here today and for joining Zonta to learn more so we can all work together to make a meaningful impact. I will now turn it over to Renee Kopic to begin today's conversation. Renee?
Thank you, President Sharon. Greetings, everyone, helping us commemorate Indigenous Peoples' Day and to discuss advocating with Indigenous women. I'm Renee Kopic, member of the Zonta Club of Billings. My fellow advocates and club members are Heather Takeshorse, Anna Schmidt, Jean Bearcrane, Melanie Tripp, and Susie DeBar. During the next hour, you will learn why this advocacy is so important and how to start working with Indigenous women. First, it's imperative. It won't go. Okay, Anna, it won't move there. First, it's imperative that we pay attention to the shocking statistics. Throughout history, Indigenous people have been disproportionately impacted by violence across the globe. In Montana, we have 7 Native American reservations, but the problems we will address are not limited to those reservations. The systemic issues persist in small towns, rural areas, and large cities. The violence against Indigenous women is everywhere and has been ignored for centuries. For instance, in the US, the Department of Justice has estimated that Indigenous women are 2.5 times more likely to be victims of sexual assault when compared to the general population. 1 in 3 women will be a victim of sexual assault during her lifetime. In Canada, Indigenous women are 6 times more likely to be victims of homicide, and 44% of Indigenous women experience either physical or sexual abuse by an intimate partner. In Western Australia, Aboriginal people make up 17.5% of unsolved missing person cases, despite making up just 3% of the population. And in some areas of Australia, Indigenous women are 80 times more likely to be victims of violence. Indigenous women generally are over 21 times more likely to be imprisoned than non-Indigenous women. These are not just numbers. The statistics represent real people. Next is Heather to tell you a few of their stories.
Heather, you're on mute.
My apologies. I have a couple stories here regarding the MMIP movement, MMIW movement. The first one I will talk about is Hannah Harris. She was 21 years old, a Native American from the Northern Cheyenne tribe here in Montana, within the US. On the 4th of July, she went with some friends and she was last seen during the firework display in Lame Deer, Montana, which was on the Northern Cheyenne reservation. She never returned and her vehicle was found abandoned, I believe the next day. Her mother reported Hannah as missing to law enforcement, but it wasn't taken seriously due to lack of resources and it wasn't acted on right away. A search party of community members were formed to look for Hannah, and on July 8th, her body was found near the rodeo grounds, badly decomposed. 8 months later, a couple were arrested for her murder, Garrett Wada and Eugene Rowland. And Eugenia Rowland admitted that on the night of 4th of July, she woke up to her partner, Wada, sexually assaulting Hannah. Rowland attempted to stop the assault, but eventually killed Hannah as Wada hit Rowland for attempting to stop him assaulting Hannah. Garrett Wada was found guilty and sentenced to 10 years in federal prison for being an accessory after the fact and disposing the body. Eugenia Rowland was found guilty and sentenced to 22 years in federal prison for second-degree murder. And after this case, the U.S. Senator Daines announced in 2018 that May 5th would be the National Day of Awareness for Missing and Murdered Native Women. Hannah's mother and sister continue to advocate for other women and girls who have gone missing or were found murdered. A second case that I want to talk about is Savannah LaFontaine Graywind. She was 22 and a member of the Spirit Lake Nation in North Dakota. She was actually 8 months pregnant during the time of her disappearance. And the day she disappeared, she had ordered pizza and went to a neighbor's in her apartment building. And that was the last time she was seen. And she was seen by her parents. Her body was found by kayakers in the Red River located on the Spirit Lake Nation. And her baby was found alive 3 days prior to her body being found. Her neighbor, Brooke Cruz, and Cruz's boyfriend, William Hone, were both found guilty in the death of Savannah. Brooke Cruz pled guilty to murder and was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. William Hone was charged with conspiracy to commit murder, conspiracy to commit kidnapping, lying to law enforcement, and was eventually sentenced to 20 years in prison. After this case, the North Dakota Senator Heidi Heitkamp introduced Savannah's Act, which aims to improve tribal access to federal crime information databases and create standardized protocols for responding to cases of missing and murdered Native American women. The baby, Hazley Joe, is almost 4 years old now and living with her father and the family and is doing really good. The third case I want to talk about is Tina Fontaine. She was 15 and a member of the Siking First Nation in Canada. She disappeared on August 8, 2014. Her body was found 2 days later, dumped in the Red River, wrapped in a plastic bag and weighted down by stones. The suspect was charged with second-degree murder, but there is no forensic evidence or eyewitnesses that could directly link him to her death. And the cause of her death was never established. The suspect was eventually acquitted in February of 2018. Since Tina's death, volunteer teams have gathered in boats to search the Winnipeg waterways for the remains of other missing or murdered Indigenous women, girls, and men in hopes of finding justice or at least closure for the grieving family and friends. Disposal of victims in water is a common tactic used by assailants, as water often washes away the forensic evidence necessary for a conviction. A statement here by
Thank you so
Stacey
much,
Boland.
Heather.
I'm
Thank
sorry.
you so much.
Oh, sorry. Thank you.
For sharing those impactful stories. I would like to start my portion of this by saying hello to all of you and to telling you a bit about myself. As a non-Native woman, I cannot speak with any expertise on this topic. Originally, I am from Colorado and I have been living in Montana for the last several years and have had the great fortune to work with, in both the professional and personal setting, many extremely inspiring Native women. It is through these experiences that I have become involved in the missing and murdered Indigenous persons work and have brought that passion to the Zonta Club of Billings. I do my best to be a humble and respectful ally. Renee just shared with us some really powerful statistics, and Heather brought us to our knees with only a handful of heart-wrenching stories. This information can and does have a real impact on people, especially if you haven't heard it before. And so I want to break it down a little bit more. Each one of these numbers, stories, are somebody's auntie, brother, sister, mother, grandmother, or partner. The impact of losing a family member in this way is inconceivable, irreparable, and inexcusable. This brings us to the systemic level. Why and how is this happening? In our developed modern society, how are extremely high numbers of Indigenous women going missing and being murdered? Jean is going to give us a look into the multifaceted reasons why, but we want to start with the foundational statement that you see here on this slide. If you are already invisible, how can you be missing? This was stated by Stacey, director of the National Indian Health Board, this spring during an Operation Lady Justice listening session. Many of you have heard of recent instances of erasure of Indigenous peoples, such as in the US, the CNN incident of labeling Native Americans as something else during a news segment on voting. Unfortunately, erasure of Indigenous peoples is nothing new, and it has been happening since first contact, colonialism, and the destructive tenets of manifest destiny. Many of our countries teach about Indigenous peoples as if they no longer exist, and many people across the United States today know next to nothing about modern, current, present, living natives in our country. Personally, growing up in Colorado, I had no idea about the lives of current Native Americans. I didn't even know that there were 2 reservations in my home state until I left the country for graduate school in Israel. This is an inexcusable lack in our education system that I'm sure is reflected in other countries. If we as non-natives are not aware of the natives or Indigenous peoples in our country, how can we do anything or even care about what is happening to them? It's hard to care about something that you know nothing about. And that is why awareness is important. That is why using our platforms to raise awareness is important. There are over 5 million people in the US alone who identify as American Indian or Alaska Native. That's 5 times the population of Montana, where we're coming to you from today, or more than the population of Los Angeles. How can that many people be ignored or forgotten? Forced erasure through colonial, genocidal, and political means have pushed Indigenous peoples into a folklorical status for many countries. But that's simply not the case. In order to address the pandemic of missing and murdered Indigenous people, we must first recognize that there are Indigenous peoples present in every one of our communities across the world, and that our governments and civil institutions owe them the protection just like every other citizen gets. We must stand up and speak out for those who have been untimely silenced and work together to ensure it no longer happens. Jean, can you please give us a little bit more information on how we got here?
I can, Anna, and thank you. One of the comments made earlier told us that today is also a day that this country recognizes and is entitled the National Indigenous Day. And our President Biden had issued a proclamation that recognizes this day as being the first day ever that Indigenous people are also recognized at the same time as Christopher Columbus and the contributions that the Italian Americans have made. And what it does is just recognize that Christopher Columbus landed in the Western Hemisphere at this time in not 1992, but 1492. One of the crewmen of Christopher Columbus, and you can see his name there on the slide, Michael D. Canoe. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing it right. I'm very sorry. D. Canoe had a diary entry. And I want to read a short entry regarding one of the young Taino tribal females that he encountered. I took a beautiful cannibal girl, and the admiral gave her to me. Having her in my room and she being naked, as is their custom, I began to want to amuse myself with her. Since I wanted to have my way with her and she was not willing, she worked me over badly with her nails that I wished I had never begun. To get to the end of the story, seeing how things were going, I got a rope and tied her up so tightly that she made unheard of cries, which you wouldn't believe. At the end, we got along so well, let me tell you, that it seemed that she had studied in a school for whores. And what is striking about this statement is that this begins the assaults made upon the indigenous groups in our Western Hemisphere. And because there are no records that accurately reflect the different kinds of attacks, killings, and then also the taking of people, we do not know even to this day how many incidents there have been. And in recognition of that kind of violence, President Biden issued a proclamation regarding this day. And in there, the federal government formally acknowledges what the history has been in the context between the federal government and then the indigenous people. And he says, we must never forget the centuries-long campaign of violence, displacement, assimilation, and terror wrought upon Native communities and tribal nations throughout our country. Today, we acknowledge the significant sacrifices made by Native peoples to this country and recognize their many ongoing contributions to our nation. So it touched my heart, to tell you the truth, when I heard about the proclamation, and then I read it, and I felt like I needed to share that with you, because our country was established in the year 1776. And this is the first time that we have a president of our country formally acknowledging the violent history that has happened between the indigenous tribes in this country and in the Western Hemisphere, and those that were colonizing both North and South America. So although the indigenous histories throughout the world have changed, I think that there are, of course, very similar aspects in the interaction with them. And many times the conquering countries that have been coming in, particularly the colonial powers that have come in to the different indigenous countries and territories, ended up making treaties with those indigenous groups. The United States made treaties, and you can see by our slide what the primary purposes were. These were not the only purposes, but these were the primary purposes of entering into treaties. As it relates to our topic, the last two purposes listed on the slide are the most important and applicable to our situation. And that was that the federal government intended to regulate the Indian and non-Indian contact, and then also recognize that there would be instances where outside people would come into an Indigenous territory and interact with Indigenous members and commit violence, commit a crime. So many times there is a clause that we refer to as the bad man clause, where the federal government promised to remove those bad men and to hold those men accountable for the violence that the bad man had committed against Native and Indigenous people, including the attacks upon women and including the taking of women and children. Next slide. I think we skipped a slide, I think. The next one is, oh, there we go, thank you. And for this reason, it's been historical that there has not been any kind of reporting that we can describe as reliable. Even if there was reporting, many times the agencies that families report a crime to the state, the tribal, the federal government are not well equipped and well enough trained to begin to try to find and investigate victims of the MMIP, the murdered and missing Indigenous people. There are no consistent databases, although the federal government is trying to connect that or correct that. And in addition, it is not uniform, where incorrect information is gathered or critical information is not entered into any kind of database. One of the things that is difficult in these situations is to try to identify the Indigenous status of a victim or the offender. The other thing that probably plays the most important part of confusion for our law enforcement is the location of where the incident happened, because it is important to know whether the incident of the killing or the taking of an Indigenous person happened on the lands owned by the tribe that the Indigenous person belongs to. Next slide, please. One of the things that has been pretty much studied is to identify the kind of victim an offender would want to take. And you can see by our list here that there are dysfunctional families, I would say, are probably the one that the offenders look for, because in doing that, they would also be able to identify people that have been marginalized. All of these factors come together to, I guess, a word would be to show what the perfect victim would be that an offender seeks. Next slide, please. In addition, we as women know, and because we're involved in advocating for women, we know that there are high-risk activities that could very easily lend itself to persons becoming murdered and missing. You can see that the violence in domestic relations, the violence that happens during dating, sex trafficking, Next slide, please. And stalking. These are activities that are, of course, encountered by Indigenous women throughout the world. You can see that there are activities that the offenders participate in and then take that opportunity to eventually do further harm to the Indigenous women. So then what happens when somebody's family member is missing? They of course go ahead and try to reach out to law enforcement, but with a family experiencing what they believe as delay, they then try to do what they can in recovering their missing family members. Next slide. So the families and the supporters of the families start organizing grassroots groups. And these grassroots groups are very, very important, at least from the perspective of the family, and then eventually from the perspective of the public. What they do primarily in organizing are listed there, but one of the main things for our purposes is that they can educate lawmakers and they can educate law enforcement officers and those departments. Next slide. And as a result of the grassroots efforts, legislation can come about. The grassroots efforts also include getting a lot of publicity with the media, and as a result, lawmakers can make important and very effective legislation. But once the legislation is created, then the next issue is the enforcement. And for our purposes, these are the primary pieces of legislation that have resulted. Thank you.
When working with Indigenous communities, there is not one way to be an ally because every community and individual is different. Every relationship you build needs to have a different approach. Here are some suggestions that will help you get started. Number one, listen to and follow the community. Every community, every reservation is different and they have different customs and traditions. Usually you try to find out who the elders are of the land that you are on. When doing long-term work with Indigenous people, Indigenous rights, building strong relationships within the community, and making sure everything is Indigenous-led is best. Center the stories around the community and know the historical culture and context. A big part of your involvement is to amplify the voices of Indigenous communities. Don't make it about yourself. You should directly share these messages with your networks in their words without alteration. Knowing the history and being culturally competent is vital. These issues the community face come from hundreds of years of ongoing trauma and discrimination. It is not the responsibility of the community to educate you. Number 4, never show up empty-handed. Showing up in support is great, but offer to lend a hand as well. Use your labor, resources, and skills to help out. What additional value can you bring to the community? Number 5, always seek consent and permission. Consent is a continuous process, not a one-time request. Seeking permission before taking part in community events, particularly around cultural and spiritual events, is always best. They'll usually be labeled something like all community and allies welcome. Number 6, be responsible for yourself. Be aware of what resources you're taking away from communities through your presence. Ensure you've given back to the community more than you've taken away. Know when to step back. Be aware of what space you are taking up. Always remember that you are there as a guest in a supportive role. There will be times when the community needs to act alone, and when that happens, you need to respect their boundaries. Number 8, saviors are not needed, solidarity is. Solidarity is only meaningful if it is substantive and not merely performative. This means showing up to support the community with your presence alone should be the baseline, not the end game. Number 9, be mindful of others' time and energy. Indigenous people often have to be advocates on a wide range of issues that affect them and their community firsthand. They do not have the choice to switch off from being involved and can spread thin in many directions. The 10th one, do no harm to the community. The community should be better off or the same because of your presence, not worse. Follow all of these suggestions and keep reflecting on your behavior, and you're on your way to doing your part in bringing down an unjust system. Now we have the advocacy and action. We have partnered with the Zonta Club of Billings. We are the Montana Native Women's Coalition, and our primary mission is to combat sexual and domestic dating violence, stalking, and sex trafficking by providing training and technical assistance to tribal domestic violence and sexual assault offices, governmental entities, and the general public. The coalition and Zonta partnered last fall to hold a red dress event in downtown Billings, Montana. The partnership brought awareness to the plight of the MMIP movement and awareness to the community to better help and serve the different programs requesting assistance. One of the projects we did was the Red Sand Project, and we partnered with Zonta, and they do it every year.
Hi, everyone. I'm Melanie Tripp with Zonta Club of Billings. I am co-chair on the Yellowstone County Area Human Trafficking Task Force and chair of the Red Sand Project in Billings. I'm also a non-Native person. I am a friend to our sisters, Heather and Jean at the Montana Native Women's Coalition, who we are all very grateful to. Wherever on this planet our indigenous sisters reside, we know they are a vulnerable population that Zontians can learn to connect with and advocate for. Red Sand Project is a successful project and tool you can use to do this. It's easy to get started. We've been doing it for about 4 years, and it can be as small or as big as you require. Next slide, please. Here are a few photos from our Red Sand projects over the past 4 years. A little backstory: in 2014, Molly Gochman filled sidewalk cracks with red sand to represent human trafficking. She's the one who started it. To get your sand, you can go to redsandproject.org. There's no cost to you. It's only shipping, and they ship all over the world. You won't have any trouble finding support. It's visual and engaging and will become wonderful without huge efforts. Next slide. Successful project. Let's see. We skipped a slide. Yes, thank you. A successful project creates marketing that you can reuse every year. It connects with like-minded organizations. For MMIP, it takes time to learn, and we've all talked about this. We need to ask to connect. That will be pivotal. A successful project also focuses not just on spreading the sand, but also education and training for volunteers, businesses. You can talk to first responders, the community, and more. And you need to make sure that your language is trauma informed. This is a picture of 2 survivors, Rebecca and Savannah. They were speakers at our event. It was taken in 2019, and they had never met before. And one last note, just be sure to prepare volunteers as they encounter victims or people who've experienced trauma. The ingredients: make sure that you have goals, and the way we do it is we set up subcommittees that are led by team leaders to execute the goals. We contact like-minded orgs and the city for support early.
We remind them that the sand is earth friendly, it's organic, it will not stain. And we're in the community, we educate, we hand out sand, we support other events, and we train our volunteers. We have a YouTube channel where we have training videos. We invite the media and we order our sand early because we need a lot of sand. Next slide, please. Partnering, we know, is key. This is a photo of one of our leaders with our homeless youth organization here in Billings. She was speaking at a Red Sand event. The more we work with groups like this and the Montana Native Women's Coalition, the stronger we become. And here is a sample timeline for you. It's provided in the slides. It's exactly how we do everything each year. It's very successful. Last steps, we always do a post-planning event. We make sure that we take stock of what we've done, and we do follow-ups, we do thank yous, we share media coverage, we get ready for next year and do budgets. And the volunteers are always very jazzed after this event, so it helps to garner extra support and extra volunteers. Next up is my friend and president of Zonta Club of Billings, Susie DeBar, to talk to you about the Red Dress Project.
Thank you, Melanie. So the Red Dress Project is a project that is visually impactful and evokes a feeling in people without them even knowing what the installation is about yet. So the next slide. The public art installation, the Red Dress Project, was created by Jamie Black. Jamie is an artist of mixed Anishinaabe and Finnish descent. She created the Red Dress Project in response to the missing and murdered Indigenous women epidemic in Canada and the United States. The ongoing project began in 2010 and commemorates the missing, murdered Indigenous women from the First Nations, Inuit, Métis, and Native American communities by hanging empty red dresses in a range of environments. The project has also inspired other artists to use red to draw attention to the issues of MMIW, and it prompted the creation of the Red Dress Day in Canada, which is May 5th. Jamie chose the color red after conversations with an Indigenous friend who told her red is the only color the spirits can see. So red is really a calling back of the spirits of these women and allowing them a chance to be among us and have their voices heard through their family members and community. Jamie also says it symbolizes both violence and vitality. And this video was just a little was put together from the event we did in Billings, Montana. The next slide.
Renee, you should be able to click on that little gray area in the bottom left where you see the arrows and the numbers of the slides. I can see it says 32. So if you click the little arrow to the right, click it again. There you go. Oops.
Okay, that'll work. Next slide. The Red Dress installation has been exhibited in more than 30 locations around Canada. The first exhibition in the United States was in 2019. And in 2020, the Zonta Club of Billings partnered with the Montana Native Women's Coalition to display the project at a major intersection in downtown Billings. Next slide. What Jamie would like viewers to take away from viewing the Red Dress Project is, her hope is the dresses allow viewers to access a pressing and difficult social issue on an emotional and visceral level before they put up their guard, before they dismiss it. We live in a world where we must make choices about the information we wish to internalize and that which we don't. So we develop defenses and ways of deflecting information as an emotional barrier. She thinks the symbol of the red dress is both subtle and compelling and also very simple and accessible. People are attracted to the dresses and often connect to them before learning what the project is about and what the dresses represent. When they do ask or find out what the dresses represent, they are often overwhelmed. Next slide. So here are some things to consider when organizing your red dress project. First off, contact Jamie Black. It may take a bit of time to find out when you can get the dresses shipped to you. And so that's where you want to start. And on the screen is a link to where you can contact her. Next slide. I'm not going to go through all these. I just want to highlight a few. So first off, as it's already been stated, reaching out to other advocacy groups and partnering with organizations that have more knowledge than you is a most important piece. It is important to build the relationship and become familiar with the organizations, groups, and community you're working with. Because with any good thing that you do, there will always be someone that has objections. And a good working relationship with other advocacy groups will ensure your success. Secondly, pick your location. You know the old saying, location, location, location. The exhibit can be displayed inside or outside. So be thinking, where can you get good visibility with your exhibit? Be sure to utilize as many media outlets as possible. Social media, print, newspaper, magazines, television, radio. Because this is such a visual project, it is easy for the media to highlight as a community awareness story. And we had quite a bit of media reaching out to us as they didn't know what was going on and wanted to know more and took quite an interest in sharing. Be prepared to take down contact information from people at the event. People will want to get involved and may have resources for you to partner with at future events. And last of all, know that the Zonta Club of Billings and the Montana Native Women's Coalition are resources as well. It is our pleasure to support you as you start your planning process. And with that, I'm turning this over to Anna to share our virtual community MMIP event we held in tandem with the Red Dress Project.
Thanks so much, Susie. Hi again, everyone. So as you can see here, and like Susie just said, another way that the Zonta Club of Billings and the Montana Native Women's Coalition and other Native local organizations and Native supporting organizations and individuals came together to raise awareness was, and have been doing for several years actually, is our annual MMIP March. The first march was held in 2019 and was the largest and first of its kind in Billings, Montana, with over 300 people marching from the university campus down to the courthouse. We had multiple speakers sharing their knowledge and experience on the topic, and this also generated much media coverage to help raise awareness on the issue, especially in the Billings area, which is an area that has been very hard hit by MMIP. In 2020, we pivoted to holding a virtual march where we had over 80 people attend with drumming, dancing, and singing to bring movement into the virtual event. And we had speakers from elders to US attorneys to advocates and those who had lost loved ones. The event also was covered by many local media sources, including the Billings Gazette, the local newspaper, and multiple TV stations. We worked for many months as a club and with the Montana Native Women's Coalition and other organizations to build this event. Heather and Jean were pivotal in this. They were present at every meeting and gently guided us in our ignorance on how to approach potential speakers, develop agendas, and create a virtual space that was culturally appropriate. We also reached out to other Native community members to help with these aspects, including getting perspectives from different members from different tribes, as like we heard earlier, not all tribes are the same, and sometimes there are big and vast differences between tribes and their cultures, even among tribes that are from the same area. Try to get as much input as you can and don't rely on one person to give you all of the input that you need to advocate for a wide ranging group of people. This year, we've decided to postpone the march. It was supposed to be yesterday, but due to a resurgence of COVID, we have decided to postpone it until May, which like we said earlier, May 5th is the National and State Day for Missing and Murdered Indigenous People. But we are really grateful to have this opportunity today to share this message, and to be able to do it on Indigenous Peoples Day is especially meaningful. I'm just going to reiterate a couple of the things that I've learned through holding 3 MMIP awareness events at this point. And this will be some points that we've already heard already, but the most important one is to center Native women. They will always know more than you if you're not Native. And understand that trust and time are held differently by many Indigenous peoples, and the whole world doesn't function on our time scale, go, go, go schedule. And there's often a richness that comes in allowing things to unfold as they are supposed to, rather than forcing them into being. Also, respect those who are giving their time and acknowledge that this topic can be very triggering for many. That means appropriately compensating people, and sometimes that does mean money if it's appropriate, and allow people the space and grace to handle this, how this topic may affect them on what is currently going on in their lives, and providing, if appropriate, some resources for handling the topic, including numbers and websites for trauma and mental health support services. We did put a couple of those in the chat today. If you are feeling triggered, this is a very heavy topic. I'm not sure exactly where everyone is joining from, so we tried to cover a range of countries, but there are a lot of resources available if you're needing help. And we are not perfect at this. We are learning as we're going. We've learned a lot through each of these events that we've done together. And it's just really nice to be able to grow and do this work together as a group. Next slide. So another example of how change can be affected from the federal level or from the larger governmental level is Operation Lady Justice, which is the result of an executive order that happened at the end of 2019 that created a task force on missing and murdered American Indians and Alaska Natives. Last year, they completed many listening sessions with tribal leaders to learn how the tribes were thinking of this issue and what they needed to address the issue. This year, they started a second round of listening sessions, which included one for grassroots organizations, in which we were invited to participate by the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Persons Coordinator for the United States Attorney Office for the District of Montana, Ernie Wayand, who also joined our MMIP virtual gathering last year. I spoke on behalf of our organization on the work that we have done and requested a mechanism aligning the various departments and organizations that are working on this topic in Montana so we can more efficiently achieve our collective goals. Ernie has been one of the outreach coordinators responsible for drafting a really important set of documents that are called the Tribal Community Response Plans in missing persons cases with the Confederated Salish and Kootenai tribes, one of the tribes here in Northwest Montana. These plans lay out how to establish protocols for addressing missing persons reports in a way that will enable the local resources to more effectively respond to these cases in tribal communities. Those templates are now being shared out widely and I believe will be a very important resource for many people across the country and even across the world as a template. And if you're interested in learning more about this issue, about MMIP, about it in the US, how you can become involved, or learning how to stand up a federal task force that is actually creating change, I highly recommend signing up for the Operation Lady Justice newsletter so you can learn about upcoming trainings and listening sessions.
Hello again. Being a genuine ally involves a lot of self-reflection, education, and listening. It means knowing we're often coming into this space from a position of power and privilege. And that's a privilege that we've gained through unjust systems that marginalize the groups with which we seek to advocate. So it's not enough to show up in solidarity and speak out against the unjust system. We have to do what's within our power to dismantle the system and differentiate ourselves from the opponents of these groups. We have to change our own behaviors and be mindful that we are not contributing to keeping that system going.
So we've come to you today with a lot of information, a lot of stories, a lot of statistics. And we just wanted to close out by boiling it down to a couple ways that you can help. You can look out for each other. You can help ensure that missing persons are reported as soon as possible. like we were able to do today, as Heather so eloquently did. You can share the stories to make sure that the names of the missing and the murdered are not forgotten. You can join in efforts as appropriate, which can be anywhere from searches for specific individuals to marches that are hundreds of people strong. You can publicize the problem and raise awareness in multiple different ways, some of which we showed today through the projects that we've been able to do as a group. And of course, work with your local government on legislation. There are a lot of resources that exist out there. These are just a couple of resources across a couple of different countries. And as Susie remarked earlier, we would be more than happy to talk to any of you on this topic if you're interested, and our contact information is at the end of the slide deck. Thank you so much, and we'll be happy to take any questions right now.
If you have questions, please enter them into the Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And I see that Sandra shared about a red dress project in Memphis that took place earlier this year. So a question came in through the chat. Samuel asked, is Zonta or other groups working with local FBI field officers and local law enforcement to present information, presentations, or events on this topic to local communities to show engagement and awareness at the local level?
Anna, do you want to take that, or? Okay, from my, I'll let Anna and I. So working with the Human Trafficking Task Force, the FBI is very involved. They spend a lot of extra, I would call it volunteer time, working with local organizations. So the best thing for you to do would be to find out who that, for our state, there's one, and then there's 2 Department of Justice agents that we have for the state of Montana. So to find out who that person is, I'm sure they're more than willing to work with you locally. And I know that Anna has also been speaking with FBI agents as well.
Yes, the FBI has started to take on, I think, this issue a little bit more publicly, but there are victims advocates as well. And I think that Jean probably knows a lot more specifics about how to bring in law enforcement through her work, but it is a very important demographic to bring into the discussion.
I guess I would just add that because of the proclamation creating Lady Justice, that there has been, I think, about a dozen or so offices throughout the country that have been created for the purpose of looking at the MMIP. So I guess one of the things that can be done then is just to contact any one of the FBI offices, and they in turn can put you in contact with the MMIP coordinator in those areas.
Yeah, and what's pretty amazing about the Lady Justice movement is that all of these organizations are now talking to each other where they weren't before.
Great, thank you. So I know that you all are obviously working in Montana, but we did have a question if you're aware of any activities going on in Colorado. And I don't know if they mean specifically with Zonta or if there's groups you know that are working on this topic in Colorado.
I know that the Zonta Club of Boulder Foothills is starting to work on this, and part of it's also through their human trafficking task force, which might be centered out of Colorado Springs. The Boulder Club has contacted us, so I know that they are looking to how they can help, and I'm not sure if they've gotten in touch with the FBI agents or not, but if anyone wants to email me, I can find that out and give you contact information.
Great, thanks, Renee. And there's been lots of questions about the recording, so we will post this on the videos page on our zonta.org website. And I will put that link again in the chat. So oops, I just sent it to Anna. I meant to send it to everyone. So we will have that posted within the next 24 hours on that page. So I know lots of people want to share the information, which is wonderful. We also had a question from Ellen, who asked if this is a national campaign. So I think she's referring to the Red Sand and Red Dress Project. Is this a national campaign? I assume so others can get involved.
Yes, it is. Mel, do you want to expand on that?
I think what we want Zontians to know that these are projects that are accessible from other organizations, nonprofits that are offering this to you. So Jamie Black and redsandproject.org, all of those are available to anyone. And I know Red Sand Project ships all over the world, but I'm certain that also Jamie Black would love to expand beyond Canada and the United States.
Thanks, Melanie. And I'm not sure if any of you know, but Beth Heiserman asked, why do we not include Hawaiians as Indigenous people?
I could speak to that briefly. I think they are considered Indigenous peoples. A lot of times they're not included in the American Indian, Alaska Native discussion that happens in the US because of differences in historical governmental relations with the Native Hawaiians, but maybe Dean could speak to that more.
All right, I'm just seeing lots of messages of appreciation and thanks for the presentation. Looking for the recording. I don't think, oh, here we go. There's some other questions coming in. How can Native women be allies to the MMIP efforts to draw awareness and ally interest by the non-Native populations in such areas as mine? And she says she lives in central Pennsylvania and she's Cheyenne. There's no reservations, but how can Native women here be allies to the MMIP efforts?
I think that would go largely to, there doesn't have to necessarily be a reservation in your area. A large majority actually of Native peoples live in urban settings. And so one thing that you might be able to look into if you don't have a reservation or a reserve or something of that sort in your area would be to look for urban Indian organizations in your area, of which there are many that do a lot of really great work and would be really amazing partners to work with on this issue in your area.
I might also add that if there's a college or university in your area, to check there and to see if there is Native American club, and they in turn would be a great resource to knowing who to reach out to.
Great, thanks Anna and Jean, appreciate your input. I think that is about all. We are at the end of the hour. If you have additional questions, the contact information is there on the slides. And again, we will make the recording and the slides available on our Zonta International website. So thank you again to our panelists for this excellent presentation. And thank you to everyone else for attending today.
Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for attending.